to the open education movement and colleagues who are here for the first time, but we have some veterans as well, isn't it? And I look at one of them and he's on his laptop at the moment, really avoiding any eye contact. But I'm going to go near him. Maybe maybe we have a chance to talk to him. Rory? Hello. Tell us a bit about how you found the conference so far, and how maybe is it in any way different? Do you see any evolution, revolution? Well, what's happening?
Well, I think it's, as our Prime Minister used to say, the universe is unfolding as it should. So I think that the movement is growing, and I've seen new faces here and old faces. And I think networking opportunities are tremendous here. And I would like to congratulate the speakers. We have some excellent presentations. And this has been one of the best conferences, open ed conferences that we've had. So I congratulate all of the participants.
Great. Thank you so much, Roy. That means a lot. And what Roy said about networking is really at the heart of why we're here. I always say, if you go to a conference and you make one contact, one new contact, isn't it, that can be sustained, can make a huge difference. So don't go for quantity, go for quality relationships. And one person can make a huge difference in our personal and professional life. So there are no World Cafes today. Are you disappointed? No? Okay. We did them. They worked in a different way than we anticipated, but we hope that you got something out of it. But we do have a number of different sessions, again, with action labs, and they are not chaired. Yeah, you know that? Yeah, but we will still manage. We managed on day one, so hopefully that will work as well. And obviously we have presentations and other things happening. But there is also, after our keynote with Dominic, who's here and getting ready, Paul is going to make some announcement very soon before the keynote, but then we have the UNESCO panel recommendations as well. Please stay for that. And some of you have been in touch with members of the committee about the potential certificate you might need for your institution. So if that is the case, please email the conference, and Marcella is going to respond and send out these certificates. Yes? So just email us, please. We said about the strike. I'm just going to stop very, very soon. I'll just tell you a story. We had Cheryl yesterday who shared her... Where is she now? I can't see. Here she is. Here, I was looking in a beautiful way, her experience, and I think brought us all in very smoothly, like I said. And reflecting on where we are, that positionality was really, really powerful, and what we do with that positionality and how we can affect what's happening around us. But we also talked about languages and the power to bring people together. So I'm going to share a very personal story. I know it's not about me, but the story is about my husband. So we had moved to Greece. He's American. And he was learning, and he still is, learning Greek. So, and he very keen to speak the language. And yesterday I was interviewed and I had to speak German. Oh, Gabi. I was born in Germany, but I haven't used the language for the last 20 years. I still can, and that was my first language that I learned. So it was painful to actually talk professionally in a language that I used to call my mother tongue. And it is not my mother tongue, but it was the first language that I spoke. Anyway. But it is about using the language. So my husband, when we were living in Greece, he liked to go in the shops, buying things and using the language. So this guy in one of the shops was asking him, so, apopuise? Do we have any Greeks here? Yes? What does this mean?
Where are you from?
Where are you from? He was speaking Greek, but he asked me, apopuise? And my husband said, Είμαι άγγελος. Ima Angelos. Do you understand that?
Yeah, I'm from Germany.
No. Angelos. Angelos. No? What did he say?
I'm an angel.
So my husband, instead of saying Ima Angelos, he said, I'm an angel. Yes, Ima Angelos. And I better not comment on this. Because he's definitely not an angel. Nobody is. But it does really show how language, and you all smiled, you know, you all found it funny, but we can connect to learning another language. It's a human inside of us that brings it out. And I'll stop here. So enjoy.
English, Anglos.
Anglos, yes, the difference is tiny. Anglos and Angelos. Okay? Okay, I'll hand over to Paul now. So thank you for listening and thank you for participating.
Well, welcome to day 3. I'm so pleased to hear that you've all been enjoying the conference. I think we try to make it as friendly and welcoming and inclusive as possible, and we're really honored, of course, to convene the open education community globally. I wanted to take a few minutes today at the start of the day before we hear from Dominic, who I'm really looking forward to hearing from, to just talk a little bit about the path forward for us, the Open Education Consortium. And so I started as the executive director, I guess a little over 18 months ago, and I've been spending a lot of time listening and talking to you all about your interest in open education, the work that you're doing around the world, and how you would like us to help you. And one of the biggest things I'm hearing is that when you think of the Open Education Consortium and what its value to you is, it's largely about us representing the global open education movement and the activities that are taking place around open education around the world. And I've also been talking to you a little bit about how we can consolidate and express that message in more powerful ways. One of the things that has emerged for us is that we'll be changing our name from the Open Education Consortium to an Open Education Global to better position and describe that value proposition as an inherent part of our name. Part of the other rationale for doing this is that the word consortium has proven to be a little bit of a tricky word in a global context and doesn't always translate really well, and in some cultures has a kind of negative connotation. And so we feel like the words Open Education Global better represent our organization and what we bring to all of you. So the logo will look like this instead of our former logo, and thank you, Mario, who is here with us. Mario's part of our team and has done just an amazing job on creating a brand and identity for this new way to depict ourselves. It also has obvious larger implications, and so our URL will change from OE Consortium, which has always been a little bit tricky to say to people, to simply OEGlobal.org. And this will happen over the next few weeks, so I expect early in the new year we'll have completed this transition, and you will find us looking like this and find us using that URL. Mario has also designed a little badge, which you see here in the lower left, which we will make available to all of you who are members of the Open Education Global, I'll say now from now on, and that's something that you can put on your website to indicate that you are a member of this community. Another reason we've done this is because as we've grown and as we've taken on more initiatives in support of the work that's happening around the world, we've created a family of websites. So yes, we do this conference, but we also do Open Education Week. We do the Open Education Awards, and we have 2 what I call regional nodes, one for community colleges in the US, the CCC OER, as many of you know it, and a new one that's been established for Latin America, which we call OE LATAM. And as those are all independent websites, and when you go to them, it hasn't always been obvious that they are part of our family, that they are a member of the Open Education Global or Open Education Consortium, as we have been known. And so we were looking to find a way to unify them all under a common look. And so this is the way that Mario has designed to show that we have a family of websites that are all doing this amazing activity around the world that are unified under this one identity. As I also listen, another question I've been getting is, what do I get for being a member? Which I really love this question because it's like, it really cuts to the chase, right? Why should we join? And I wanted to just take a few moments today to talk about why you might, if you're not currently a member, why you might choose to become a member, and of course to thank those who are members for being part of us. Obviously, as a member, you're supporting us in helping put on events like this. And so if you are not a member and you find an event like this valuable, you should realize that it's the memberships, part of it, the way we can do this is by having membership dues. And so the conference, the awards, and Open Education Week, and the regional nodes are all initiatives that we can do because members support us. And then every year we take on, beyond those things, special projects that are sometimes just one-offs that we just do for that year, sometimes are things that we continue to support over time. This past year we did some support. Igor was a mentor for the Open Education for a Better World initiative. And we also, I don't know if Carolina's here from Warsaw, from Centrum Cyfrowa, but Nicole is, so we all collectively did an Open Education Policy Forum in Warsaw, and then with Martin Dugiamas, who many of you have spoken to, who's been here at our conference, we did the Open EdTech Global Festival last week, which is focusing on the EdTech infrastructure of the open movement and how we can embrace it and also help it find its voice. And so these are special projects that, again, being a member helps us be able to do. But I'm very actually interested in also providing some very direct benefits to members. And so earlier this year, we did a needs assessment of our members to hear from them about what they'd like us to provide directly to them as a benefit. And on the right-hand side, you can see some of the things that were expressed. People want to connect to each other, to collaborate on projects. People want professional development and to learn the best practices about open education. They want to work together on policy and strategy, and they want to have a network through which they can communicate, ask questions, get support, find out who's doing what, and celebrate some of the great things that are happening. So we'll be, over the next year, focusing more on this right-hand side, as well as continuing all those other activities, but trying to build out more support and initiatives to enable what I call member-to-member collaborations. So the way I see this is that those things that are on the right-hand side are largely about connecting you to each other, so that you want to partner not with us, but with each other around projects. And the professional learning can happen by connecting people who want to learn about one thing with others who already have expertise in that, and so on. So this is more about member-to-member connections and collaboration than about Open Education Global now creating a whole suite of services that we provide and roll out. So I think the first piece that we'll do is create a listserv that will become a listserv for our Open Education Global members that will provide a forum for them to talk to each other, to ask questions, to seek support, to express interest in finding certain resources and so on. And that will become part of the new website as we begin to roll out this identity. Another component of the listening that I'm hearing is that open education is for everyone. And many of you have told me that historically you've viewed our organization as being primarily about higher education. So we have actually diversified our membership categories, and these are the new categories. And as you can see, we have diversified to also be more inclusive of who we think we're trying to serve, to include primary and secondary, to also include non-accredited education providers, those that are doing lifelong learning or workplace learning, and even cultural organizations and government. So a much more comprehensive set of categories, which we feel represents the growth of the movement, and we hope is welcoming for others to begin to join us and help grow the movement from the current 240 plus members we have from over 44 countries to even something bigger. And when we say open education is for all, we're also talking about the inclusive forms of open education. So we frequently are talking about open education resources, but as we've heard throughout this conference, it's also about MOOCs and open pedagogy and open access and open data. And so, you know, there's the teaching and learning side, there's the research side, and I love actually the conversations that have been happening at this event around the community service side of open education. And I think all of those we see as part of our organization and part of who our members are as they engage in open education. So when I try now to describe what is our role, what is the Open Education Global Organization, and what is it that we're trying to do in terms of the services and the functions of the members of the organization, specifically staff, we're looking to do these things: build community, convene events like this, provide support at both the grassroots level but also at the senior leadership level, help with advocacy and awareness, play a role in curating, communicating, and showcasing, and facilitate the matchmaking that I think is so inherently powerful in our movement. And so this little picture I did quickly the other day, but it's sort of like a map of the world, and what you're seeing there are the little logos representing where we currently have members, and also the two regional nodes we have, one in North America in the US and one in South America, and we hope to have more going forward in time. I do want to thank, as part of this transition, my staff, who we actually have an incredible team, and they're all here. And I wonder if you can just join me in thanking them it's just an incredible honor and pleasure to work with them, and we're really humming as a team right now, and I hope you can feel it. And I should also say, we actually have stickers. I know everyone loves stickers, so you'll find on the sharing table today stickers associated with our new identity, and it's a big sheet with stickers for all of the different things that we're doing, so I hope you'll pick them up and help people grow in their awareness of the new identity that we're adopting. I also wanted to announce a few things. Open Education Week, which many of you use to showcase and celebrate your own open education initiatives, is happening on March 2nd through 6th, 2020. So if you haven't got that in your calendar, I really encourage you to take advantage of this event. It's completely virtual, it's not place-based at all, and anyone can put onto the Open Education Week website the events and activities that you're undertaking during that week that are about open education, and the extent to which they're virtual, and invite other people to join and participate in them, even better. And I want to invite Marian to join me on this stage. Next year's conference will take place in Taipei, Taiwan. And the dates are the 20th to the 22nd of November. We took care not to overlap with US Thanksgiving next year. And there will be a little card that looks like this one on the screen, again on the sharing table. So if you want to pick some of these up and distribute them to others you think might be interested in joining us there, we welcome you. And I'll just invite Marian now to say a few words about it.
Hi. I'm Marian Wang. I'm from Taipei Medical University in Taiwan.
Okay, it's my honor that we can host the conference for the next year. And I'm looking forward to see you all in Taiwan and share ideas. Also, drink a lot of bubble teas. All right, we got a lot of a place to see around, and I think we will have a lot of events there. Thank you very much.
And Taipei looks beautiful, really. So I think it will be amazing. The last thing I want to mention in terms of announcements is that, as you all know, last week UNESCO passed and adopted the OER recommendation, which I feel is like a really historical moment in this movement, because that instrument is a little more binding than the previous declaration, and it also signals that 195 member states around the world are committed to doing open education. And so behind the scenes, we've been working to form a little bit of a coalition of sister organizations, and this is really just the start, the ones that I have up here, so don't take that as final, but of sister organizations to help support the implementation of the OER recommendation. Because now we have an OER recommendation, and it's awesome. Actually, the things that are in it, I really am fond of and feel have a strong potential to make a difference. But of course, it's one thing to have a recommendation, it's another thing to actually do it. And so now it's kind of, we're moving into the harder part of actually implementing the actions. There's 5 action areas along with monitoring and reporting in the recommendation. And we felt that it would be fantastic if we could form a coalition of organizations who would all collaborate together on developing support and then delivering support. And the way I kind of conceptualize it is that, for example, Open Education Global would work with these sister organizations to create resources and services that we would then make available to our members to help with the implementation of the recommendation. And as you know, 195 member states, that's a lot of countries around the world, and some of them will have already been doing stuff in open education, but many of them will not, and will need some real bootstrap support to get going. So these organizations have agreed to be part of the coalition. We'd like to share across the sister organizations the efforts to, like, who already has resources that can support the recommendation, where do we have gaps that we need to create more things, and then how can we collectively look at rolling out this implementation and support to our members and the larger community. So going forward in time, you can expect to see this coalition, and I expect other members to join representing parts of the world that perhaps aren't adequately represented by the current members of this coalition, to begin announcing support and services and resources that can help you implement the OER recommendation. Actually, some of our sister organizations are here in the room, so thank you so much for agreeing to be part of this. I think it's fantastic that we not only are starting to see collaborations and connections among practitioners in the field, but also around organizations who are engaged in supporting the overall open education effort around the world. And I really look forward to working with all of you. Last couple of things from me. We've been, of course, celebrating our sponsors as part of this event. And many of you have been enjoying, I think, these Ferrero chocolates and the coffee, the little coffee ones. I know I ate a lot of those yesterday at the World Cafe. And so this is actually, Ferrero's essentially our chocolate sponsor of this conference. They donated these chocolates to the conference for us to make available to all of you. And you'll find throughout the day that lots of these chocolates continue to be available, and so I hope you enjoy them. I wanted to also say that we have had a professional photographer working at this event for the last couple of days and will still be here today. And we've already uploaded the photos from day 1 and day 2. And here are the links. And I tried to simplify them. They're all in Flickr. And so I did a bit.ly simplification of the URLs. I encourage you to go look at these photos. They're really beautiful, and they're all of you. And I know often we all need to make use of a photo in our work, and so I hope, they're all openly licensed, of course, and so I hope you find a photo of yourself or the work that you've been doing here at the conference that you can use to help communicate what you do to your peers. So OE Global 19 Day 1, OE Global 19 Day 2, OE Global 19 Awards, and then OE Global 19 World Cafe 1, 2, and 3. Those are all different collections of photos from the last 2 days. And of course, there'll be OE Global 19 Day 3 after today. And with that, I'm finished. Oh, no, wait. Susan will hit me if I don't say this. You can also expect to receive from us a survey, which I know is a really typical thing to do after a conference, but we really do welcome and ask you to provide some feedback for us on how you enjoyed this conference, like Chrissy's been doing with people at the beginning of each day. I think that's a wonderful thing, and we would love to hear you tell us about your experience at this conference and to make some recommendations on how we can actually make it better for you with future conferences going forward. So that link to a survey will likely come out today. And with that, I'll turn it back to, who's introducing Dominic? Is it you, Susanna? Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. So, as you know, my role in this conference is to make you feel lucky. It's my main role. But about this, I am a little bit sad today because we failed in providing to you the very famous product of the city of Milan. You know, Milan is very well known in Italy and all over the world because of the fog. Is the fog our best product? We failed in providing this to you today, but I suppose that colleagues that are leaving by flight can feel lucky for this, so we have achieved the goal anyway today. Very well, so we can start today. You know, as a director in METI, the Learning Innovation in Politecnico di Milano, my main job is about faculty development. And always when I am looking to convince teachers that it's very relevant to think about curricula, to think about methodologies, to innovate our approach, I always said we have to do it because it rains too much or it doesn't rain at all. Not everybody understands it, actually. But I strongly believe that the real objective that is moving us towards new reflections and new actions, I hope, about education and open education, is that we have all to learn to be better citizens of these worlds. Not just students, we like very much students, we have loved so much the first keynote with them, not just young people, but all of us. So I am more than happy and honored to introduce Dominic Orr that will share with us very, very interesting reflections about how universities will look in some years. Thank you so much.
Probably do it here. Okay.
You can see.
Somewhere there's there was one. Probably it's in day 3. There was one called Dominic, I think even. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, and
the
the
PDF,
PowerPoint.
PowerPoint.
Okay, perfect.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Good morning. There'll be a picture of fog in just a second, so this fits perfectly. Yeah, so I'm feeling rather privileged to have the chance to speak to you this morning as keynoter. It's really great also to follow on from the other 3 keynotes we had, because they're all, for me, very key topics. I'll be looking at them in a slightly different direction, or from a different perspective today, but the topics of the student voice, seeing everything from a student's perspective, or from the learner perspective, maybe to be a bit more expansive. Looking at the possibilities of digitalization for changing our ideas of learning space, I think is also important. And also, of course, the importance of thinking about social injustice, social justice, and inclusivity in higher education and in the education system generally. You may know that I work quite a bit on the policy level. So my perspective on a lot of this will be really from a kind of a macro perspective, thinking more about how the system of education, of higher education, could change in the future. I should mention also that I'm adjunct professor at Novo Gorica University, and you know they are one of the conveners of the summer school Open Education for a Better World. We've also got a master program starting the end of next year on leadership in open education. And I also work for a learning platform called Keynote. Keynote is based in Berlin. We are quite a young organization. We pretend a little bit still to be a startup, although we're 5 years old, and we have about 80 staff now. But we started out by taking up the topic of how can we support refugees to get into higher education, and how can we use digitalization to support that. And I actually joined them earlier this year because I just thought, okay, I've been doing a lot of work on the top level, kind of talking about change, talking about the things we want to have. I'd like to get more involved in actually doing it, and so that's why I'm at Keynote, and it's given me already great insights into some of the challenges of this, what we're calling wide open learning, and I'll talk a bit about that at the end as well. But firstly, a picture of fog. I've been living many years in Germany, but I'm British, and very often when I go home, I live very near to Wales, and my thing is always to go out with my dad. We go to a mountain bike park, and I go mountain biking. Now, the point is, for me, I'm not interested in my mountain bike. In fact, in this case, it was a mountain bike that I hired. What I'm interested in is the experience of the mountain biking. I'm interested in the flow, I'm interested in the challenges, and all of that. So I think we can take that a bit as an analogy to one way for us to think about education and how it's organized, and all of these cool things, including open education, that we think about. So here's a list of things that I'm actually not really interested in. I'm not interested in open educational resources, not interested in open education, not in artificial intelligence, digitalization of education, or open badges. Not in the first instance, because I'm really interested in higher education. And I think we have major goals for higher education at the moment. I also think we can think much more expansively about what we mean with higher education, and we'll come to that, I think, when we come to some of the pathways I want to present. But I think this is a list that we developed when we were thinking about what might the future of higher education look like. But in fact, this is a list that applies, I think, in very many contexts, although in our case it was particularly for the German context and also for the European context. But I think part of what we have to do at the moment, in a situation where a lot of reform is happening in education, we're talking a lot about the significance of higher education and lifelong learning for creating, sustainable societies, societies able to cope with the huge change coming at us, then these are the kind of key things, I think, which are part of what we've often called the university experience, but we've often seen as implicit parts of this experience. And I think now, when we think of reforming and changing, we have to make everything that until now has been more kind of implicit ideas much more explicit, because then we can check whether all the reforms, all the ideas we've got are really helping or contributing for us to achieve those goals. So the study programs need to reflect and react to developments in society. This is, of course, why we see such a focus on higher education and lifelong learning at the moment. I was in the German Federal Ministry 2 days ago, and we were talking about possible changes to the study aid program, and the representative for the ministry was saying, forget about investment in innovation in companies, forget about thinking about how we're going to support people getting housing. Let's really, really focus everything on developing skills and competencies in society, because this is the key to sustainability. And so our idea really of higher education is that this means for us not just giving skills, but enabling people to reflect on those skills, be critical about society, but also to think about what future reforms they would like to have in society. So I think, again, the education experience in higher education should be about maybe even kind of practicing social reform, so that the graduates can go out and actually enact this in the future as well. And I mentioned already a very key thing, which is I think we have to think also more expansively about learning spaces. This is something I'm particularly directing at higher education. When you see a lot of discussions at the moment about how higher education should be changing, one of the big things is, there's these great kind of fab labs. We need fab labs on campus. We don't need fab labs on campus. We need to connect to the fab labs that exist in the community. We need to open higher education. That's really more about it. So higher education shouldn't be this kind of enclave. It should be a place which is always reaching out and bringing people in. And when we think about bringing in, it's very important to know that the day before yesterday was World Access to Higher Education Day. This is done by a friend and colleague of mine from the UK, but it's a hugely global initiative now. On that day, there were many, many tweets from right across the world, from universities, from groups of students or people in the community, making efforts to try and make higher education more inclusive. This is because it's a challenge in every single country of the world. Sometimes we just think, it's just our country. So Germany, for example, we know we've got a huge challenge there. But our challenge is, let's say, different to countries like, let's say, the UK, where because on the first instant one would say, okay, Germany, we don't have tuition fees. We don't have tuition fees, but we have other forms of selection, which is creating a rather exclusive higher education experience. So we need to think about this, and that's why I think we need to kind of re-look at higher education, and that's what I'm going to present to you. And then we can come back to the thing about, okay, what about open education? What role can it actually play? So a number of years ago, I was asked by the UNESCO Global Education Report to prepare a background report on indicators for the new Sustainable Development Goal, which was also related to higher education, which is either 4.3 or 4.4. And one of the things it says in that goal is that there should be access to high-quality learning, including in universities, for all. And one of the things we were thinking in the group when we were working on this is, what does this for all really mean? And then we kind of got more to this kind of traditional idea. Yes, chances and opportunities for all, but there can still be some kind of selection. So I actually propose now, on reflection and thinking over the last couple of years about all the projects I've been doing and people I've been meeting, that I would actually like to totally reformulate this goal for sustainable development in education related to higher education. I think it helps hugely if we start from this perspective, which is, why don't we just say, let's assume everybody we see will some point in their lifetime take part in higher education. This, I think, is a huge change in perspective. Instead of the thing which I've been also working on many years, which is, okay, we see their selection, who are the people who are not being included in higher education, and how can we support this group? So I would like to change it the other way around, say, let's just assume everyone is going to come to higher education. That means then we have to think about, okay, so that means some people will be older, many people will have very, very heterogeneous learning biographies, so we have to think how we can support that. People will not be able to study full-time, how can we support that? So this kind of change in perspective, I think, is quite helpful. And now we come to some of the ideas we developed within the study we did for the German government. And I think it's really true that very often when we're thinking of higher education, we're thinking of a kind of a closed ecosystem. Now, very often the closed ecosystem will be the campus. And many people who are, for example, against, digitalization will be saying, okay, but we need the campus experience. So they're thinking of this kind of closed ecosystem where everything is controlled, the student needs support, etc., but it's all within a particular place. If you look at the worst iterations of digital learning, it's the same idea. Only in that case, the ecosystem is the learning platform and the interaction of the student through their computer, through their laptop. So that's why I think it's really important to think about how our higher education is organized, and also maybe to change this perspective from the student. This is a great photo, I think it was from 1980, yes, for first forms of digitalization. In many universities, it might not look like this, but it feels like this, I think, to the students for sure, and often that's the way we organize higher education. Now, the interesting thing is, let's take more of a perspective from what it's really like for students. This picture on the left, this is quite interesting. I was stuck one time on a journey through Germany, and I had a longer stop than planned in Mannheim. And sometimes I just think, it's just kind of fun to go and visit a university. So I went to this university and just tried to find a place also where I could sit down and work. And so I was sitting here and I realized above this room on the left was an auditorium where a lecture was going on. In the lecture, there were about 20 people sitting really spread out in the room, nobody really paying attention. In this learning space, all around the lockers, were students working together in small little groups, working collaboratively on their learning, on their university experience, as it were. So I think that's one really important point. And we can see, for example, this is a picture, I was very recently at the University of Cyprus. They have a new library, and we see at the moment this kind of re-emergence of libraries as centers of learning. And they've spent a lot of resources and money as well on making this fantastic library, but it's full of people working, full of people studying, and they've also said this is not open just for students, but it's open for the whole community. So I think this is something about these learning spaces. So another thing, what about what we really think about how students are actually living? So for about 10 years, from 2005 to 2015, I was the international coordinator of a big study where every 3 years we did a survey of students in 30 countries in Europe to find out about where the students came from, but also how they were spending their time, where their money came from, what they were studying. So we tried to kind of understand almost the socio-demographics around their studies. So the latest figures show us that 51% of students in Europe work alongside their studies. The other thing they say, and this is really interesting, is we asked we set up this one question, which is to ask students, do you feel primarily like a student who works alongside their studies, or primarily like somebody who's working and is studying alongside their work? And you can see here how this change happens the older somebody is. And I think this is really important for us to consider as well, this kind of way students are perceiving their, their identity as a student. So you see, the older the student is, the more they're saying, yes, I really, really want to study, and study is really important to me, but it's only one thing in my life. And many times also on a policy level, and this was one of the slides we discussed 2 days ago at the Federal Ministry, on that kind of level, people don't think like that. Because they think, yeah, of course the student is studying full-time and their full concentration is on their study. That can only be possible for one group of students. So when we start thinking of trying to be more expansive, trying to offer more learning opportunities, we have to be realistic about how students are living as well. Another thing is, and you may have seen this because, or this idea because it's become popular over the last year, this idea of the 100-year career, and when you start thinking like that, then you think about, okay, well, how might learning happen within that? Now, our general idea of education is it's kind of like a one-way track. You get on this track, and at some point you exit it, and you never go back. Now, I actually promised my daughter that I wouldn't tell another anecdote about her, but unfortunately, and she knows I don't think this is good, she thinks she's at the end of this track as well. So she's 24, she's done her bachelor and master, now she's working, she's like, okay, I never have to learn again. That's not true, but our education system is planned as if it were true. And this is really a problem, and I really don't think it's helpful at the moment where we make this split between higher education and further education. It's much more fuzzy than that, and especially if we're going to be more inclusive. This is just something funny I saw the other day. I'm part of one of these European university consortiums, and this was at the University of Essex in the UK, which, to be fair, is a very, very inclusive university. But they had this funny sign just near the guest house, and I actually happen to know what a ha-ha is, which is this kind of funny gap here. But I just really like the actual the text here, which says, "We don't take any responsibility for injuries resulting from play or other activities." And I thought maybe that's also the kind of thing of the way we see formal education. It's like, no, this is serious. Don't play around. Get your studies done. So I think this is the whole thing about we have to think much more about these open learning spaces where we can experiment, because experimenting is part of higher education, I think. And then I also think it's nice. I've been following Ron Barnett for a long time in his many studies, always rethinking the place of higher education and university education within today's society. And I found this interesting because I really think some of his earlier books were really focused a bit on the research university. He then also had a book which I think was called The Entrepreneurial University, but now this idea of what he's calling the ecological university, I think this is really the interesting one, which is the university for others. So it's this idea of an open university which is for the community. So then one of the topics I've been working on the last few years is also thinking about digitalisation and how that might help us to open up spaces. And of course, when we're thinking of digitalization, then, that helps us build up networks, communication, and it helps us to build it in such a way that we can use that for these new learning spaces. But we know for sure in every country, I know probably better in Germany, but I know for sure in most of Europe at least, these opportunities are not being taken up by the universities. When we did this study on the future of higher education, and I'll present some of the pathways in a second, the kind of disappointing point for me was when we were looking at looking for really cool initiatives or institutions which were doing this kind of thing, they're always on the periphery of the formal system, not in the center of it. And that's a bit of the point, that we have to try and think about how we can move this right into the center. So now the 4 learning pathways. Now the thing about this 4 learning pathways idea is this was a study we were asked to do by the German government, and the actual contract was, or the commission was, to look at how digitalization would change higher education running up to 2030. And we're an international consortium and we particularly looked at changes in the work market or in the job market, changes in technology itself, changes in the didactics and the way we learn, and then also obviously changes in the student body. And quite early on in this study, we went back to the ministry and we said, this is not really going to be about digitalization. We think the key point is to think about the learner, and let's look at everything from the perspective of the learner. And this is where we came up with these 4 pathways, which we think kind of sketch the higher education landscape moving up to 2030. But very important for us was not to do something which is kind of just in the future. All of these ideas we developed, we think they exist now, but they're not systematic. They're not often they're not very big, and they're not really supported in the way the normal higher education system is. And I also did a study a number of years ago where we looked at, in Europe, different access routes into higher education and how they're organized. And we also came up with 4 different kind of types. And we made the mistake of calling the types type 1, 2, 3, and 4. And every time when we were talking to other people about it, we couldn't remember ourselves which were the types. So we got round that this time by actually calling our different models by the names of toys. So the first model, and you saw a small instance of it right at the beginning, is what we're calling Tamagotchi. And in a minute, I'll present them a little bit more in detail. But the important thing about Tamagotchi is not only this idea that it's a closed ecosystem, but it's also this idea of this one block that I was talking about. Higher education is one block. Now, this one block might be that you do a bachelor and leave, but it might be you do a bachelor and then a master's, or even a bachelor, master's, and a PhD. But it's still this idea, it's one block. Maybe you do something else later, which we're calling further education, but the system is not really interested in that. When we take then the next model, this is Jenga. This is, this game, you'll see a picture of it in a minute, this game where you build up towers. The point of that idea is that what about if the first part of higher education was shorter and more focused, but it already assumed you would be doing other bits later and it kind of planned them in. The third one, Lego, is really what we've probably been talking about, and which is probably is quite disruptive. It's just a question of can you support it in such a way that it's also inclusive. And then Transformer is something that, at least in Europe, has been a huge thing over the last 20 years, which is how can we open up higher education for adults, for older people? And the thing is, we've done that, but we normally treat them as soon as they get to the university as if they were 18. So I'm going to present each of these models a little bit in detail. So the first one with Tamagotchi. the point about it is we still believe that there will be lots of changes. There's lots of changes that can happen around the classic university model. And the other thing is, if we think, because we always thought for each of these models about exactly these points of the job market, the didactics, technology, and organization, then there is a strong argument for this kind of model, particularly for young people who are going into higher education. They need support, at least at the beginning of their studies, to be able to kind of, as one would say, become academics. So you support them for self-reflection, you give them support in what kind of courses they should be doing, and you support them didactically along the way. But of course, the whole time this is kind of pre-programmed in a certain way. So in fact, that's about the didactics. Now, on the job market, what we've noticed in the job market is the job market has been through a phase where they say, I only want ready-made, fully fledged graduates. So they have kind of promoted, at least in part in Europe, that people not only just do a bachelor, but follow up with a master's. And then they get to the job market, and then we still hear from the job market, okay, no, these are not exactly the people I wanted. But part of this idea still, and the answer from higher education is, yes, but they've learned what we call graduate attributes, and that will also that will give them the skills which will help them not only work now, but also adapt to changes in work in the next 10, 20 years on the labor market. So there is an idea behind that, but of course when we see changes and how technology is being used within this system, it's always an add-on because the organizational structure is pretty much the same as it was before. So that's the point. Can we actually break this out a little bit? So, and this is when we get to the Jenga model. And this is the idea of, it's quite a didactical model actually, because it's the idea of maybe when we take this, we build this kind of tower, which is what we first think is the course, which is the bachelor course or the master course. Maybe we can rethink it and think that maybe not all of those elements in it are absolutely necessary. We could take them out and say, okay, those kind of elements can be learned through modules much later in life. And maybe those modules will also be offered by different educational providers. The interesting question here is what role could the university play within this? And I think the university could play a key role because they could maybe even design the whole bachelor program with the assumption that part of it won't be offered by them, but they'll be still accrediting it. So I think there is a role of this big idea that we had also in what we're calling the Tamagotchi model, but making it more flexible and thinking much more about this thing that there are changes on the labor market which we can react to, but at the same time, this is maybe more inclusive for some students who feel, yes, I want to learn something in higher education, but I want to know it's something I can use relatively quickly. So this kind of only doing maybe a 2-year program. So in Europe, we've got an expansion of 2-year programs at the moment. But it shouldn't be just a 2-year program. It should still be accompanied with a big kind of didactical and educational plan of what that pathway should be. If we don't do that, it still remains relatively socially selective. And that's why when we get onto the next model, that's why that's such a key element. Now, this Lego idea is really this idea that what about if the student or the learner is completely in charge of what they do? So they go out and they decide what they want to do. This doesn't have to just be things online, which I think was a little bit of this idea of kind of with the first kind of MOOC hype, which is you sit at home and you just pick up pieces. Some of these phases that you could be learning, they can be presence phases. You could be doing 6 months at a campus, or it could be longer or shorter than that. But the point is, you as the learner, you are actually designing this learning pathway yourself. Now, of course, you need a lot of advice for that. There's 2 elements you need. You need a lot of advice for that, and you also need a much more flexible system of recognition because that system has to be able to recognize all those pieces so they're really valuable to you as the learner. And then that's when things like open badges or micro-credentials can play a key role, I think.
Yep.
Then we get to the final model, the transformer model. Again, this is something we see all the time in recent reports now, which is we see this idea not only that we have to offer higher education to those who maybe have missed out earlier on, but we also see this idea now that there's so much changing in the labour market, people will definitely have to go back to university or go back to studies to learn more. Now, the didactical challenge here, and the one that absolutely hasn't been fulfilled, is you've got two elements to this group. The first element is it's a long time since they were at school. So one point is they may have forgotten certain things, they may be slightly out of practice. How do you do tests and all these, artifacts that we have in our educational system? But the other thing is, it could well be that the younger pupils are learning new things which these people haven't been able to learn. So on the one hand, you need to support this group a lot, especially at the beginning phase of higher education. On the other hand, they're bringing masses of experience with them from families, from communities, from being in the labour market, and all of that they want to see reflected in their studies. This also will help them a lot because they need particularly to have something which they can use to get them jobs after their studies as well. So they need to be able to kind of bring in this experience. And again, this is we've got this on a very small level, at least in the Bologna process when we talk about accreditation of prior learning, but it's much, much bigger than that. It's firstly really recognizing what people have done already, and then kind of adapting the study programs and the learning models around that. So on the one hand, you need a lot of support at the beginning, but you also need a lot of adaptation to the specific needs and specific interests and specific competencies of this group. So then I just wanted to give you 3 small examples of things that I think are interesting in that context. And I'm sorry, I have to use Kieran as well. We have our own app now, which we which we offer for our students. We really are trying to offer what we're calling wide open learning through the digital platform that we have. And we're focused, as I said, on refugees. We have 7,000 refugees on our learning platform. They are our learners. Originally, this was, as I said, an initiative to support refugees who came to Germany and were having the problem that the universities wouldn't accept that these people had any kind of knowledge or competencies, because in Germany, we're quite bureaucratic. It was the question, okay, can you prove that? And they're like, no, I was fleeing. And so we kind of stepped in then as Kieran, as a kind of bridging to say, okay, we'll take any of these refugees, we'll support them in their learning, and we'll have a partnership with these universities and say, okay, we can tell you they've been on our program for a year or so, this is what they've learned, and then we hope that the university will not only accept them, but also maybe recognize some of the learning they've done with us to actually speed up their learning programs. And the big impetus behind this, and the reason why this kind of got a lot of traction in Germany, is because the biggest group of refugees we were getting in Germany were from Syria, and everyone knew the Syrian education system is pretty good. So that's how it started. This year we've made a lot of changes because we realized that our problem is the bottleneck is still the university, because the university is still causing problems, and we realize we're doing stuff that the university would like to do themselves anyway. So we've spent the year now working on short programs, much more focused on what we think our learners need and want, and we're just about to launch early next year then an open badge program where we can think of how can we offer these kind of alternative credentials for the students. So On the other hand, we still have the problem, and that's something, again, we'll be working on next year, which is how can you build a community around this digital learning piece? Because that's the key element. We focused really this year very much on the kind of the content side, and now next year we need to focus more on the educational side to really make this much more valuable for our students. But we have a lot of interaction with our students, and we do know it's empowering them, it's helping them, they find this very important, and we do have students who go on then to study in German universities and are successful as well. But so this is one way you can think of being more flexible about what we mean by higher education, because in our very first iteration, we were called the Keynote University, and then we got in big trouble. So that's why we're called higher education now. But I think this kind of provision is actually very important, and this is a bit to my point where I think on the phrase of the normal system, this kind of development, and Keynote is just one example, is happening a lot. And it's a question of can that be built back or integrated better into the formal system as well. Talking of this whole thing of building communities around a digital learning platform, we at Keynote, we're involved in a project which was commissioned by the European Commission. And it's called Erasmus Plus Virtual Exchange, and it's exactly focused on this point, which is it's the idea that many people would like to have exchange. You know the Erasmus program as something which is very, very successful also in promoting physical mobility within Europe particularly, but it's very exclusive. So even the European benchmark for the physical mobility is 20% of graduates should have experienced physical mobility during their studies. So that's a high number, but what about the 80%? So I think what's happened here, and this was, again, one of these things which started focusing really much more on, okay, what about if we're thinking of this mobility question outside of Europe? This virtual exchange is super relevant also within Europe as well. And I was discussing this a little bit last week with the European Commission, and some of these ideas of at least blended learning will be built into the next program. So you can see that even within the kind of the established system, there are more ideas of trying to flexibilize learning and also make it more open to more people. And the last example I wanted to give, I mentioned already, I'm Keynote, we're part of the what's called the UFA Alliance, Young Universities for Europe. This was a big initiative from, I think, about 2 years ago, where the European Commission said, wouldn't it be great if we had European universities as collaborations between universities? And it's very interesting. There are 17 alliances at the moment. And suddenly, actually, within this context, many of the alliances are thinking really quite out of the box about how to organize studies. So one of the things that we at Keynote are particularly working on is what's being called the virtual campus, and it should be a way of connecting students between all of the 8 universities. In fact, it's more than that, because we've just merged the official partners and the associate partners. So all of the partners will be much more connected through the network. So this is a way of us expanding in that way through digitalization, these learning opportunities. I just wanted to mention also another thing, it's been mentioned a few times before, Open Education for a Better World, which is, the deadline is passed, but I'm told that really interesting submissions might still have a chance. And the other thing I wanted to mention in connection to that is the Leadership in Open Education program, which we're developing. These kind of things are important because I'm really, you can see very much about how I'm arguing. I'm really interested in all of this stuff, but only when we think about how do we really bring it into the mainstream and how do we use it to change the mainstream. I really would like us not always to be on this kind of, this edge piece. So then I think we really can, after all that, then we can start thinking about all of these things like open education, open educational resources, artificial intelligence, etc. But I think it's really, really important. We know what the challenges are outside. We know it's about changes in the job market, changes to knowledge and the competency profiles that are expected of students, of learners, of citizens in society. We know there's a lot of demographic changes happening, and technology, of course. There's a lot of changes there, but the most important thing is to think of all of that from the learner perspective. However, when we then kind of make a flip and think, okay, what does that all mean? Then I think the scheme that Rob, Martin Weller, and I developed for what we called the OFAT study is a kind of helpful way to then think about, okay, what work is then to be done to try and think about how can we change the learning experience. This goes back a little bit to this idea of unbundling, but I'm really most keen to think of how this is all connected. So very often when we're thinking of changes, we often only think of certain parts of this whole kind of cake here, which is, of course, one of the points is, what is the access and the delivery of the learning opportunity? This would be something where digital can play a huge role. This is where we think of, different access regulations to help students also get into university. And then, though, because we know we've got then a diverse group, an increasingly diverse group, which we welcome, then we also have to think about what kind of learning content support and what kind of didactics do we need to support that. And, of course, the ideas of co-creation play, I think, a key role here, because we shouldn't try and second-guess things. We can build the creation part into the educational process itself. But we mustn't forget about the recognition and certification of knowledge and competencies. And I'm also a little bit involved in kind of the open badge stuff. And the open badge guys, they say, don't talk to me about content. I'm not interested. I'm only interested in my badges. And I think it's really important that we always think about, how do we bring this all together? And that's really my point here, is to really think, how can we bring this all together? How can we think about OER as a key element to all of these changes and to supporting our students, but also think, okay, if we've got OER, what are the other elements we need to make sure that that creates a comprehensive and coherent system for the learner, which is useful for the learner after their studies as well. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Okay, we'll do it again. Thank you very much for a very insightful talk, Dominic. The 4 pathways, I found that fascinating. But they're all plastic or very rigid toys, so I would challenge that. I would like to have a conversation, because we talk about flexibility and molding, and I thought some Play-Doh would be lovely. So maybe you can think about that. So any questions from the audience? Okay, Virginia?
Hi, Dominic. Nice talk. My question is about the higher education landscape in the world, because I feel sometimes that when from the global north talk about higher education institutions, are often referring to their model of higher education that is quite elitist and very selective. And higher education is very different in each part of the world. For example, in Latin America, higher education has a more social and connected with the society model. We don't have, for example, in my country, we don't have selective process. we have a lot of difficulties to be inclusive because people doesn't achieve secondary to finish secondary school, for example.
Right.
And we have a lot of difficulties, for example, in relation to social conditions, for example, and economy. So how we can think in models that can take on account the different kinds of model of universities, and I don't know, for example, how is the models in Asia, for example, or in Africa. They are very different and have different missions. So I think we have to think in different students also.
Yeah. So thank you. Of course, there's always difference, but I think still this model, which we're calling Tamagotchi, that's everywhere. It really, really is, and that's part of it. Because once when we were doing this study, then also the ministry is saying, yeah, but what about quality assurance? What about how you're going to fund those different forms? And we said, okay, let's leave all these governance questions later. But I think the huge expansion we've had in higher education across the world particularly in the last 20 years, has been driven by one idea of one model and has been accompanied by a certain form of governance, which in the end has led to a lot of bureaucracy, which has limited the chances within higher education to experiment, particularly with teaching and learning. So you're quite right. Of course, you can always find really great initiatives, but not on a kind of systematic scale. And I think we still must really be serious about the fact that higher education is absolutely exclusive everywhere. You can go to Lithuania, and 74% of people in a cohort go to higher education. But half of those are paying for their studies, and the other half are paying nothing. So we've got the system is always built in a very exclusive way. So we have to kind of tackle these bigger things first. But I think, of course, when we start thinking of, how do you actually implement or how do you actually change, then you have to go to the real context and think about how can you build it around the real context and interest. But, the other thing is there hasn't been enough focus in higher education on teaching and learning in the last 20 years either, because everyone was focused on research and expanding numbers of students. So the challenge is there, but of course there are differences within and between countries. And I've just been in West Africa very recently, and in West Africa, it's a bit irrelevant what the universities do because it's only 3% of a cohort who go to the university. So when we then think about what we want to do, we have to totally think outside of the model. So I think part of our problem in development in every country has been we're too focused on what we think the formal system should be like, and it's normally based on a legacy from before. And you can, for sure, as you say, see historical legacies within different higher education systems which make them different. But I think on this very high level, they're still not flexible enough, and that's why they're so exclusive.
Thank you. Yes? Okay. Okay, thank you. First, thank you so much for so much inspirations in a so brief time, actually. But I am wondering if universities nowadays are enough vital for rethinking their self in a Jenga Lego set transformers model, or if this transformation has to come from outside. For example, are universities the best social subject for developing a new mode for evaluating competencies? I'm not sure. What do you think about it?
I think this is really to my point that I really think over the last 20 years through expansion, we've developed a whole load of things which are really just artifacts which we can question. And, you know, and a lot of it has been to cope with expansion. So really, I mean, I understand the perspective from the university leadership as well, and also from policy, which is, you know, let's try and keep it simple so we can keep the expansion working properly. But I think now it's time to rethink all of these things properly. And I really think it's disappointing if we see that the only really interesting things are happening at the peripheral outside of the formal system. And that's the most disappointing piece, I think, because if you ask what is the kind of common understanding of a university of itself, it says it's, you know, experimental, it's always thinking of its place in society, but it's been a bit lazy over the last 20 years on this thing, I think. So I think that's why we have to rethink that, and that's why it's really great that, you know, people like us have the opportunity. And we see now there is a change, I think, where on a strategic level there's more openness for quite a few of these things. But then we have to start playing the game of realizing how do we sell cool ideas to a mainstream system. And I think that's a huge challenge, I think.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk and interesting analogy. I've been thinking in the similar line and come to the conclusion that in order to really make that happen and possible, the learners, individuals, have to own their own learning and data. And if we are all institutionally oriented and thinking in terms of institutional framework, you mentioned that the ecosystem, stuck in the ecosystem of institution. Yeah. But how can actually make that individual at the center and the owner of all the learning, that would be ideal, but there's not much incentive for industry and not much incentive for probably individual government in a sense, because it will become less controllable. Do you think that's really possible? Or do you think that would be the direction we should actually work towards?
So I think, to your point, the thing I'm worried about is if we say, you know, and this is a bit of the Lego model, if you just say, okay, it's really up to the learner, they kind of put it all together themselves, then you're expecting an awful lot of that person to be able to do it, and it becomes socially selective for sure, because some people come from a group where they can ask their friends and their parents, another group, no one around them has got any experience of that. So then you have to think about, okay, well, what kind of support could be given on another level? And I think really it's a lot to do with the fact that I think universities can pick this up. And it has been interesting for me to see what has happened with this university, this European University Initiative, because it's kind of forced the universities to think about, okay, what would it be like to have teaching and learning if you're not one institution but 8 and you're all doing it together? And somehow that's already opened up some of these questions that are key to us anyway. So because we know this kind of collaborative thinking can be helpful, so it's been interesting to see that happens. I think there is a certain openness on the policy level as well. But of course, if you always think from the institutional perspective of a university, of course they're firstly thinking, right, have I got enough money to do this? How am I going to keep my staff? We know in many, many countries at the moment, academics are having a more and more precarious career. So it's difficult to build them, to bring them into something where they're supposed to be more kind of experimental and expensive. So we've got huge problems here. But this is why I think part of the solution is to not just think of this as higher education on its own, but think of really how can we have a good educational provision throughout somebody's lifespan. And then when you start thinking like that, then there's a lot of things, but they're just not connected. And there's a lot of, there's a lot of government bodies or support systems for the individual pieces, but they're never really thought from the perspective of the student. They're never thought systematically. They're just thought from the perspective, okay, I'm representing this sector or this issue or unemployed people, and that's part of the problem. So somehow we need a new, bigger perspective. But maybe, I don't know, maybe there seems to be a certain openness on the policy level for that, I think. And maybe, if we work more on, monitoring and evidence that we can use for that, that helps. So this has been, for sure, I was very surprised with this study because it's been very welcomed by the German ministry. And Germany, I don't know what you guys think of Germany, but Germany is not a leader in innovation. No way. Germany is good at doing the next bit, but new ideas don't tend to come from Germany. And it was very interesting to see that they could really work with this idea. So, but of course, for the policy level, their next thing is, okay, this is all very cool. Which bit are we as policy responsible for? But that's then the next piece. But yeah, so we need this. It's not enough to leave it to the student, I think, but having the student perspective should be key to policy as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Interesting what you say about the Germans. The Germans always say Vorsprung durch Technik.
Yeah,
so,
durch Technik, nicht durch Innovation.
Man braucht Innovation. Okay, one more question. But there's coffee also waiting. I know the conversation is really interesting. You have another mic.
Thank you very much for your nice presentation. And the Tamagotchi sounds very familiar to me.
Yeah.
My organization, ASCA Academy, is now planning to issue open badges to those who completed our courses translated in Japanese. And in that sense, I would like to ask you, what are the benefits and the challenges of open badges to be used for this OER field?
Thank you. Yeah, that's maybe a nice thing to finish on because I think this connection is really important with the open badges. We've just I think 2 days ago, we released an English language study that we'd done in Germany on discussions we had about open badges in the German setting. And we've also sketched there 3 different scenarios for how you can use badges. I don't think it's useful to have badges which just replicate what you get anyway on your certificate. And that's the kind of thing that makes everyone nervous. Because they think, okay, but this badge thing is kind of. But I think badges, and badges is a terrible name. It's just a digital format of documentation which is highly standardized and enables you to make lots of links to lots of other things which you can never do on a piece of paper. That's what's cool about the badge. But the nice thing is also that you can be slightly more flexible. So the badge, I think, is really important for the kind of what I was calling the bits of the university experience which tend not to be replicated in your transcript of records or your certificate. And that is really important for the learner, I think, because that gives them something super useful for when they leave college as well. So, great initiative. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. Right, we can see that some of you will have more questions for Dominique. You're staying with us, you're not flying away. Okay, so during lunch, there might be an opportunity. Now, we are running a bit late, and many of you are running out of the room already. It's fascinating, but there will be still a coffee break, and we'll start a little bit later, and then everything will move, because we have a lunch break at 12:40, so we can move that. Yes, a quarter of an hour later we start. So it's now, what time is it, Paula? So 10:40. So we start at 11 o'clock, the next session slots. Is that okay with everybody? Thank you.